Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? I wanted to talk today a little bit about some of my impressions, some of my ideas, etc., my thoughts on the Powered by the Apocalypse games. And these are games that are all based on the engine that was first put out in the game Apocalypse World. I actually only own one in physical print copy, and that is Mythos World. And I got this particular game kind of on the advice, if you will. I just kind of read what he had written about this particular game. It kind of distills a lot of the mechanics or rules of this game. They're a lot more evident. They're laid a lot more bare, and they're not covered or obfuscated or otherwise smothered by some of the other stuff that tends to get written in a Powered by the Apocalypse game. It may not be the best one out there, you know, by a good margin, but it's a lot clearer. Like, well, how does this actually work? I have a whole bunch of other ones in PDF form, and in fact, right now I've just started to play a game called The Veil, which is a kind of it's kind of an atypical Powered by the Apocalypse game, but it still runs on the same engine. Now this is a system or game engine or mechanic that I've been intrigued by for a long time. You know, maybe at least a couple of years ago, I had a video talking about the actual mechanic of it. You know, I really find the 2d6 mechanic and how that works to be really seductively elegant, and in a lot of ways, you know, they have the bakers actually have, you know, because that was the first game was Apocalypse World, kind of distilled a lot of, I guess what you call the best practices is a word that people have been using for that, of like how we used to play or some of the better ways we used to play, and you know, kind of codified them into the rules. Like, this is how you should play the game. And sometimes that's great, and sometimes it can be, some people can find that a little restrictive. You know, it depends. I mean, there's nothing really bad about it, it's just different. But I want to talk so far about my impressions about it. I was actually having a conversation with Jason, Dark Age of Roleplay game. You know, after we played The Veil, he was, I think we were talking yesterday, he's like, well, how did you like the experience? Because I'd made some, you know, recap video and everything. And, you know, as we were talking, I said, we should really play a session of something, you know, pretty much Powered by the Apocalypse. But I was thinking to myself, well, why don't we just do it a little bit more generic? And I'll get to that in a minute. But the system itself, if you're unaware of how the system works, I'm going to try to give you the blitzkrieg. You know, generally, characters, like in a lot of other games, they have stats. And, you know, the stats can run the gamut of what they actually are. And typically, in a Powered by the Apocalypse game, you're going to have 5 stats. 2 of them are going to have a +1 modifier, 2 of them are going to have a 0 modifier, and 1 of them is going to have a -1 modifier. So there's a couple things you're better than average at, a couple things you're average at, you know, one thing that you're not so good at. In The Veil, there's actually one that has a +2 modifier, so there are 6. +2 modifier is gigantic. It's gigantic because you're talking about using 2d6 rolls. Anytime that you do something that's going to require a dice roll, which is, in these games, is called a move, at that point, you know, you roll 2 6-sided dice. If you roll 10 or higher, you get what you want. Sometimes you actually choose from a list in that particular move. Like, you know, you get 3 of these items. But, you know, pretty much you're saying, I want to do this. You know, I want to climb over this wall and get a, you know, hide from my, you know, to hide in the shadows from my enemies, because that's going to be a safe place, and maybe spy on them, you know. And you roll a 10 or 11 or 12, and pretty much you get that. You're able to do that successfully. Although sometimes you may have to choose from a list. What of those things that you were trying to get do you actually get? On a 7 through 9, games handle a little bit differently, but essentially you kind of get what you want, but there's a complication. You don't get all of it. So maybe you just get to choose less items on that list. And maybe you get up there, but you're not really able to spy on your enemies, and you're not really able to hide in the shadows. But at least you're up on top of the roof now. Or it could be something where there's a misfortune that happens. Like, you get up there, but in so doing, you hurt yourself, or you drop some item that you really wanted. You know, sometimes the player gets to choose what that is, and sometimes the game master, you know, just makes something up, whatever it happens to be. On a 6 or lower, that's called a miss. You know, 7 through 9 is a weak hit. 10 plus is a strong hit. 6 or lower, well, you don't get what you want. You failed. And then, in many cases, it might give you some kind of prescription in the particular move, or the game master, it may prompt, or just about always prompt, a game master move. Game master moves are just, you run the gamut of the things that, like, we do as game masters, where you introduce some kind of complication. You know, somebody else, you know, you have the Raymond Chandler moment where people run through the doors, you know, shooting guns or whatever. You know, runs the whole gamut of consequences, or just things that keep on happening in the world. You know, pretty much what happens a lot of times in a Powered by the Apocalypse game, which is not all that different from what happens in a lot of other games, the way like a lot of us played them, is that by moving throughout the world, the players tend to trigger things happening. When you're in this situation and you interact with the environment, then stuff happens. The other way the game master moves can come about is if the players are just they're kind of inactive, they're waiting for you to do something. Well, then you do something, which is once again one of our standard operating practices. The world is always going on in the background. If you're just standing there, well, watch out, here comes a train. And it doesn't always necessarily have to be negative. You get the idea that you just kind of throw something else in there. You get things rolling again. So really, really elegant. I love the way that it gives you this degree of success or failure. And I really enjoy the success with a complication. In the games that use this engine, it's funny. One of my biggest critiques of Powered by the Apocalypse games, as I started to look at them, was it was very hard. Like when you're trying to talk to somebody else about like how does Powered by the Apocalypse work? What's the basic system, etc. It's very hard to explain because as you read the books, in general, the system itself is so buried underneath the fluff or the setting specific feel of the games. Like Apocalypse World itself, it's groundbreaking, but the way it's presented is it's really hard. You have to kind of dig to figure out, well, what's the actual meat and potatoes of how this game works. Like we've been having these conversations lately about the 2D20 system, which the big boys in that right now are Star Trek and Conan, and there are a few differences in how those systems work. It handles this differently here, or it has a different name for this, or whatever happens to be. But for the most part, you can talk about how those systems work, with another person. Same thing for like I think Legend of the Five Rings and 7th Sea First Edition, or just choose some other system that people just know how it works. People know how the D20 system works or whatever. Okay, what are the differences that they did in this particular game? Oh, they added this. Oh, okay, but I understand how this works. What I just told you about the Apocalypse World game in terms of how the dice mechanic, that's the core of the game. But then you can look at two different games and realize that the moves all have different names and are completely different. It's really hard to, and sometimes they're very tailor-made to the genre, or a lot of times they're tailor-made to the feel that particular author wanted to impart to the game. And so while you're trying to look for the familiar, as you're going from game to game, sometimes it just isn't there. And that's one of my biggest critiques of games powered by the Apocalypse, is they're so buried. The guts of the game are so buried underneath whatever feel the author was trying to go for. Which I understand why they do that, but sometimes they don't necessarily translate well into each other. And as you're trying to learn the new game, you're like, well, what move is this? I know at this point I'm trying to do something. There should be a conflict here. What the heck is the move for this? So, one of the things I really want to do with say Jason is go ahead and play a game like that, and just any time that a situation comes up where it's obvious this would be a conflict, it's obvious that this would be a moment that would require some kind of dice roll, then we go ahead and roll the dice, and maybe at that particular point you have a bit of a discussion. If you roll in the 7 to 9 area, well, what should the complication be? One of the other things that I've noticed about the Powered by the Apocalypse games is they have a tendency to be give a lot more authority to the players over like what's actually true in the game world. Especially, let's say you roll one of your hits. You roll a 10 or higher, or a weak hit. Roll a 7 to 9. Oftentimes it will have the player actually choose. Well, choose from this list what things actually happen. Now, sometimes I understand that's kind of an intent-based thing. You declare your intent prior to the roll. This is what I'm trying to do. Maybe you don't narrate the entire thing of what happens, which is I don't like to do that. But you declare your intent, so then it's obvious. What things would I choose out of this list, because I already told you that my primary intent was getting up on top of this building. Everything else is kind of gravy at that point. Other times they can be a little bit more collaborative, and it can be. I don't think you necessarily have to play it this way, but the way a lot of the games are written, it gives the player a lot more authority over what's actually true. There's a move in the Veil, which is called like the Link move, and a lot of games have very similar moves, or moves that do this in one fashion or another, where essentially you invent a non-player character, and then you talk about your relationship, and depending how the dice roll goes, your relationship with them may be strained or it may be great. That's not necessarily horrible. Oftentimes, and once again, it's kind of a formalization of what some of the best practices. Every once in a while, I'll ask one of my players, and one of my players wants to go to, I need to go get armor, whatever the heck it is. Okay, well, tell me where the armor is. It's not that important, and maybe this will be interesting where this goes. They have a formalization of that. But because it's formalized, it's assumed to happen all the time when they do things like that. And sometimes that can be fun, but sometimes that can be a bit of a drag. There is a certain amount of, depending on what kind of feel you're going for, it sometimes can be a little bit less immersive because both from the player standpoint and I believe from the game master standpoint, because the players have a bit more input. Nothing wrong with agency, but sometimes that kind of it screws with the feel of the world, or the feel of being a character. I don't believe you necessarily have to play it that way, especially if you're just going to go generic with the Powered by the Apocolypse engine, which is something I'm really interested in doing. Other than that, I still really dig it. Here's my final impression, and this is kind of a funny one. It's a type of game, like many, that get away from class and level for the most part. However, the games have things called playbooks, and the playbooks are kind of analogous to class, not really. In some ways, they're very analogous to archetype. You're playing a particular game, you're playing a particular field, so you might play, in Mythos World, you might play the academic archetype, you might play the criminal, you might play the investigator, you might play just the guy that's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And, on and on you go, because this is more of a Lovecraft type one. There's a couple things about the playbooks that irk me. The first one is, in general, in a Powered by the Apocalypse game, only one person at the table is allowed to play one of these playbooks at the same time. So, if somebody's the investigator, that's the only investigator. And, sometimes that bugs me, because, at least in fiction, or sometimes the way I played games, sometimes there are two investigators, but it's or two warriors, for lack of a better word. But a lot of times the games go in a particular, they go for a particular archetype. The other thing I noticed about the playbooks, and they give you special moves in these playbooks too, which are kind of analogous to class skills or profession skills. Like only the academic guy would be able to know certain arcane formulas or whatever, which makes sense. Nothing wrong with that, and that's kind of common sense. I think if I was playing a generic version of this and we decided we're going to go do Lovecraft, a good chance if the regular guy on the street was trying to come up with some kind of formula that would open a dimension, probably not, but a good chance that the academic or the occult investigator, he might have a better chance of doing that. But sometimes I find the playbooks a little bit more restrictive than even classes or archetypes, because it's very prescriptive. And with the playbooks, you get to choose various moves. You unlock one or two moves, and then maybe later on with experience you can open more. But at least so far in my reading in a bunch of these games, it really kind of narrows the type of character you're going to play, and it's very prescriptive in terms of what their personality is. You're free to fill in the blanks, but you have to read a few of these games, and once again, it's about how much additional text and additional fluff and additional mood setting writing gets done in these games, which is very common. It will inform you a lot about what this particular playbook or character is going to be like, and it's odd in the game that gives you so much agency in one way, really kind of constricts you in another way, and that's just an impression. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just impressions. Overall, though, I am really interested in playing like this, in playing some more of these games, not just the published ones, but I'm really kind of hot to sort of play a little bit of freeform and see how it goes, because it's a very, like I said, it's a very seductively elegant, compelling mechanic to use, and I really do think in a lot of ways they have kind of distilled some of these best practices of how we used to play. So really kind of interested in doing a lot more of that, maybe in the coming year. And so that's all I'm going to say about that. Once again, the video got long, but what are you going to do?